Let's get started then. Welcome, everybody. Thanks very much for being here. I am Reinmar Seidler, member of the steering committee of New Hampshire's Network for Environment, Energy, and Climate. And we're meeting on this post-Veterans Day Monday evening to think about and talk about how the U.S. military is dealing with current and future climate risks. And it's quite complex because on the one hand, military power has always been closely linked to energy consumption. U.S. Department of Defense is the nation's single largest consumer of energy, and that I think that means it's probably the world's single largest consumer of energy. The military consumes about 77% of the total federal government energy budget. Substantial. So more than three-quarters of energy that the federal government as a unit consumes goes to the military. Many military systems are extraordinarily energy intensive. Um, an F-16 with the afterburners engaged uses something like 10,000 or even more than 10,000 gallons of fuel per hour. The afterburners aren't usually engaged for as much as an hour at a time, but that's a vast amount of fuel. Numbers are hard to get your head around. And obviously, military readiness has been heavily prioritized over energy frugality through recent decades. But more recently, the military has also been rethinking some of its patterns of energy consumption, partly because heavy dependence on fossil fuels does generate some operational vulnerabilities and risks for the military as it does for society at large. And this is what we'll be focusing on tonight. We are extremely lucky to have a really extraordinary panel of speakers with us. I will briefly introduce them in just a second and then turn the mic over to them. First, let's remember that although we are known here as the New Hampshire Network, this event takes place in Ndakina, the ancestral homeland of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wambanaki peoples, past and present. We acknowledge and honor the land, the waterways, and the people who have stewarded Ndakina throughout the generations. Secondly, our panelists tonight are longtime friends and colleagues, so this will be an informal conversation more than, or rather than the conventional series of presentations with PowerPoint and all that. Our intention is to leave a good amount of time for questions at the end, so please do submit your questions in the chat at the bottom of your screen. And now let me briefly introduce our amazing panel of speakers tonight. First up is Tom Oppel. Tom has more than 3 decades of experience in communications, policy, politics, defense, international relations, sustainability, and management. He's founder and president of O2 Strategies, which maybe is pronounced Oxygen Strategies, I'm not really sure. And it's a strategic advisor firm for 8 years from 2009 to 2017, basically through Obama's administration. Tom served as Chief of Staff to Secretary of the Navy Ray Mabus. In this capacity, he oversaw development, execution, and communication of the Secretary's policies, goals, and objectives throughout the Navy and the Marine Corps and the whole Pentagon. Among the major achievements of his tenure was starting to shift the Navy and the Marine Corps away from fossil fuels. By 2017, renewables accounted for over 60% of energy consumption ashore and nearly 40% at sea, which is amazing. When President Obama asked Secretary Mabus to develop a recovery plan for the Gulf Coast following the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, Tom managed that effort, and I definitely have some questions about how that's gone. But second of all, we've got Admiral Dennis McGinn here with us. Dennis McGinn is a strategic advisor for the public and private sectors, operating at the intersection of energy, environment, and national security. Admiral McGinn served on active duty in the United States Navy for 35 years as a naval aviator, test pilot, aircraft carrier, commanding officer. and national security strategist. He was Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for warfare requirements, and he commanded the United States Third Fleet. From 2013 to 2017, Admiral McGinn served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Energy Installations and Environment. And in this position, he worked together with Tom, leading the transformation of the Navy toward energy efficiency and renewable energy and microgrids. Admiral McGinn is a former president of the American Council on Renewable Energy, ACORE, where he led efforts to define and communicate the economic, security, and environmental benefits of renewable energy. And then we have Captain Bob Smith, who retired in 2019 after 30 years in the Navy SEAL teams. Captain Smith is a Naval Academy graduate. He served in East and West Coast SEAL teams, including as Commodore of all the East Coast SEAL teams. His combat tours include multiple deployments in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Somalia, with his final tours as senior military advisor to the Secretary of the Navy and Special Advisor for Operational Artificial Intelligence to the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence. Since his retirement, he's been advising industry and government on applications of advanced technology to strengthen national security. And following, Lisa Marie Cheney is currently a partner with Mission Reliance Partners, firm specializing in federal business and strategy development, with a focus on AI technology applications that support U.S. national security. Before that, she worked on the National Security Council transition team for President-elect Trump, where she was responsible for developing the first 100-day and the long-term policy strategies for the National Security Council. From 2017 to 2020, she served on the Nuclear Energy Advisory Board of the Department of Energy. In that capacity, she was tasked with assessing and promoting the U.S. competitive position related to small modular reactors and advanced nuclear reactors. All right, so this panel obviously offers a truly amazing depth of experience and breadth of perspective. We are so grateful that you're all willing to share some of it with us. And now I will let Tom Oppel start us off. Tom, the floor is yours.
Thanks. And it's just O2 strategies. The O2s, I like the oxygen, but I will just say my last name is pronounced like the stone, Oppel. So okay. I know it's spelled like it should be a short O, but at any rate, thank you all for being here. I did have the tremendous honor to serve as Chief of Staff to Secretary Mavis in the Obama administration. Secretary Mavis was actually the second longest serving, he was the longest serving secretary since World War I. There was a man named Josephus Daniels who was appointed secretary by Woodrow Wilson right at I think it was like 2 days after Wilson was sworn in, was inaugurated, and in March of 1912. And I used to joke that there were days in the Pentagon where it felt like we had been there since World War I, as opposed to just the 8 years that we were there. Secretary Mavis is a former governor of Mississippi, and that's actually where we first met when he was when we were both much younger men. I was a journalist in Mississippi, and he was running for his first statewide office, and we got to know each other. And in 1987, he ran for governor, and I was his press secretary, and then served in his gubernatorial administration. He went on to serve as, in the Clinton administration, he served for 2 years as ambassador to Saudi Arabia, which is where the beginning of his appreciation of the oil fossil fuel situation came about. He, at the time he was going to Riyadh, he talked to me and asked me if I would come with him. He had one political appointee that he could bring, and I had just become a partner in a DC political consulting firm, and so I turned him down. In the 2008 campaign, he was Barack Obama's most traveled surrogate. And as you might imagine, having a former Southern governor campaigning on behalf of Barack Obama, it's pretty easy to see why he became the most traveled surrogate. And when President Obama was putting together his transition team, they basically asked Ray what he wanted, and he was really only interested in the Secretary of the Navy job, which we found out later was the second most requested position in the Obama administration. First was ambassador to Australia, since they speak English and it's half a world away. That the attraction was sort of obvious. Ray, having served, as he describes it, a very undistinguished Navy career as a very junior officer during the Vietnam era. He served aboard a cruiser in the Med, but he was very interested in serving as the Secretary of the Navy. And then once he was nominated for that, he called me again and said, "You can't turn me down twice." And so I, having had no previous experience with the military and having never served in uniform, walked into the Pentagon, and as you might imagine, it is a pretty intimidating place. Just finding your way around the building, 26,000 people go to work there every day. I believe it remains the largest office building in the world, and it's just a pretty incredible place. But one of the first things, having worked on political campaigns with Secretary Mabus, one of the first things I did when I first came to Washington and sat down with the secretary was to say, all right, well, let's plan back like we did with elections. What are your objectives? What is it, at the end of your tenure, what is it you want to have accomplished? And one of the first things he said was, I want to start shifting the Navy and Marine Corps off of fossil fuels. It's interesting because this was not the first time that someone had sort of focused on climate change and the military's impact on climate change and the global implications of that. In fact, there's a woman who remains a friend, Sherry Goodman, who served at DOD in the Clinton administration, who had focused a lot of attention and time on the issues of climate change and how those issues impacted the military and military readiness. And she was making some progress. And then, in addition to a change in administration, obviously 9/11 happened. And at that point, the focus shifted. It was all about the war on terror, and something like climate change was seen as a nice to do, but not really compared to what we're trying to accomplish with getting bin Laden and dealing with Al Qaeda. That's our focus. But even then, in sort of the history of logistics came back. There's a famous phrase inside the military and the military community that goes, amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics. And you can see this throughout history, but it most famously in the 2003 in the Iraqi campaign, the U.S. Army Fifth Corps was making a charge toward Baghdad and actually stalled because of logistics, because of concerns, the CO's concern over the supply chain. Now, the person who was leading the first Marine Expeditionary Force, later to become one of the Secretaries of Defense for President Trump, was a Marine General, Jim Mattis, who actually hated his nickname of Mad Dog, and didn't want anybody to call him that, although President Trump insisted on it. But Mattis had actually planned ahead logistically, as Marines do, and he managed to avoid the supply chain issues that the Army ran into. But even after that, one of his very famous quotes was that in the future, the military needed to be, quote, unleashed from the tether of fuel. And so, and the fact of the matter is, I point out, there was an article that I helped Secretary Mavis write in Foreign Policy, that focused in part on the history. And if you look back even as recently as World War II, the Germans realized that they didn't have a dependable supply of fuel. And so one of the reasons for their pivot to Russia was the Caucasus oil fields. And the Japanese as well were looking to the oil available underneath the South China Sea. And frankly, after the Battle of Leyte Gulf in 1944, essentially the Japanese defeat there meant they essentially were out of gas, and essentially for the last year of the war tied up their ships. They were no longer a threat to the U.S. Navy. We were seeing this in 2009. Obviously, the U.S. military was still actively engaged in both Iraq and Afghanistan. And at the time, we were losing one Marine for every 50 convoys. And these convoys were mainly providing fuel and water to our advanced bases in those two countries. As Reinmar said, the U.S. military remains the world's largest fossil fuel consumer. I know at the time, these numbers have obviously changed somewhat, but at the time we were there in the early part of the tens, if you will, the DoD was consuming about 93% of all fossil fuels used by the U.S. government, and was spending, and this is DoD wide, about $15 billion annually on fuel, on oil and diesel. And then in 2011 and 2012, there were a series of price spikes in the price of oil, and they added $5 billion annually over what had been budgeted by DoD for fuel. And again, for the U.S. Navy and the Marine Corps at the time, every dollar increase in the cost of a barrel of oil added $30 million each year to the budget. There is an estimate, at least one estimate out there, that says that the U.S. spends nearly $100 billion protecting oil exports around the globe. So having served in Saudi Arabia and having been aware of this and just generally sort of having thought through these issues, and as Lisa knows, as Denny knows, when you're up for a government job, you go through a very intense period preparing for Senate confirmation, and this issue of energy just came up again and again. Secretary Mavis said in his preparation for the confirmation hearings before Senate Armed Services Committee. And so in October of 2009, Secretary Mavis scheduled a major speech on energy. And in that speech, he laid out 5 goals for the Navy and Marine Corps. The most important of which, in the end, was to set an objective for the Navy and Marine Corps to reach at least 50% of its fuel to come from renewable sources by 2020. And I'm going to let Admiral McGinn, who can talk from a number of perspectives, which is why his advice and counsel in the second term of President Obama, the last 4 years we were there in the Pentagon. I'll let him talk about the outcomes because he was so instrumental in helping achieve those. But at the time, those goals that Secretary Mavis laid out were considered very aggressive. Even some people thought that they were fantasy, that they were unachievable. And obviously, we drew a lot of criticism from particularly representatives from oil-producing states like Texas. And very famously, in one House Armed Services hearing, a Republican member of Congress basically shouted at my boss, you're the Secretary of the Navy, not the Secretary of Energy. Why do you, what is all this about? Why are you wasting time? And we had prepared for that. And so Secretary Mavis responded, and it was something that he used pretty consistently after that, that the Navy, the US Navy and navies generally have always been energy innovators. After all, it was the Navy that went from wind-powered sail to coal in the middle of the 19th century, that went from coal to oil at the beginning of the 20th century, and had pioneered nuclear propulsion in the middle of the 20th century. So Navy has always been an energy innovator, and given the amount of energy that it requires to do the missions, the various missions of the Navy and the Marine Corps, that only makes sense. So we thought it was important. Obviously, there was the environmental component, but we thought it was critical to couch the case for Secretary Mavis's goals from a mission standpoint. What are the Navy and Marine Corps missions, and how does this complement? How does this fit in? And so we made the point clearly that climate change was a significant risk to global security, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But the fact of the matter is, when you look around the globe, the Navy and Marine Corps are truly the world's first responders. When there is some sort of disaster, be it a natural disaster from extreme storms, earthquakes, tsunamis, or even man-made disasters, it is the Navy and the Marine Corps that are getting there first. When there was the earthquake in Haiti, it was, and the Air Force couldn't get in because there was no the airport had been destroyed. The Army couldn't get there. What got there was a Navy ship with Marines who disembarked and do what Marines do. They took the beach and started getting organized in terms of relief. When the Fukushima nuclear plant was inundated by the earthquake and the tsunami, one of the first requests from Japanese government officials was for Navy nuclear officers to assist in dealing with those disasters. So, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief is always a priority for the Navy and the Marine Corps. And the fact of the matter is, it's obviously the right thing to do, and it's just who America is. But obviously, it also helps deter conflict. One of the primary sources of conflict in human history has been the battle over resources. And whether it's water or food or getting away from heat or storms, that's often what is the source of conflict. The fact of the matter is, we also realize that oil prices are set globally. So even as the U.S. was moving toward becoming more and more of an oil an energy exporter as opposed to an energy importer, which we had been for for so long, certainly in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. We had very little impact in terms of the global price of oil. And so those price spikes were really hurting us, and certainly hurting readiness, because budgetary having to spend extra money on the cost of fuel meant we couldn't fly as much, we couldn't sail as much, we couldn't train as much. And then, as I mentioned, we did a piece in Foreign Policy in 2013 focused on the geopolitical component. And at the time, we were focused on Russia. And we pointed out that there was both a vulnerability for us with fossil fuels, as well as a potential vulnerability for the Russians that we might be able to exploit. The vulnerability for us was the fact that our allies in Europe were pretty seriously dependent on Russian oil and gas for their energy needs, particularly for their heating. And that was something that the Russians not only could use as leverage, but obviously at the beginning of their invasion of Ukraine, they did try to use. The opposite side of that coin was the fact that almost half of Russian governmental revenues come from the sale of oil and gas. So our ability to move away from being a market for that gave us the opportunity as well to degrade the ability of them to have funds to cause trouble. And the last thing, in his speech in 2009, we used we sort of tweaked the phrase from the movie Field of Dreams, which I hope you've all seen. It's a great movie, particularly if you're a baseball fan. But in that speech, Mavis twisted that phrase from that movie, and we said that if the Navy comes, they will build it. And by that, we meant that the Navy could provide a market force to help generate innovation in the energy field, be it biofuels, be it batteries, be it wind and solar. All of these things we felt like we could help. And frankly, that's something the military has done for a very long time. If you look around today, if you've got a flat screen TV, thank the military. If you've got GPS, thank the military. So many of the things that we use today on an everyday basis originated from military research and development. And so I'd like to say that one of the things that I'm proudest of, and again, I'll let Admiral McGinn talk about the outcomes here, but we were very proud of the progress that we were able to make. And the fact is that since we left in 2017, and actually beginning even earlier, when we first started, there were a lot of folks, and there are still some folks out there who think climate change and energy and fuel shouldn't be a priority for the military. I don't see how you can make that argument knowing the logistics. But I'm proud of the fact that while we were there and ever since, every single service chief, when they go before Congress, when they speak to the House Armed Services Committee, when they speak to the Senate Armed Services Committee, they identify climate change as a significant security risk to global stability. And I think we can all see it. So I'm going to stop there. Happy to answer any other questions later on, but I'm going to turn it over to my good friend, Admiral Dennis McGinn.
Hey, thank you, Tom. It's really great to be with you all. And I too look forward to questions and things that are on your mind. I'll tell a story about myself. Back in 1995, my first tour in the Pentagon as a newly caught admiral, I was running all naval aviation programs, including buying aircraft carriers, airplanes, helicopters, missiles, etc. I heard about this thing called climate change and rising sea levels. And I said, quite with tongue in cheek, well, gee, if this climate change and sea level rise is real, more than 70% of the Earth's surface is going to be covered with water. So we're going to need a bigger Navy. So I just wanted to try to make that point on budgets. Just kidding. Let me set some context. Our energy security, our economic security, and our environmental security are all inextricably linked. You can't really do anything big in any one of those security areas, energy, economy, and environment, without thinking about the effects on the others. And another way of thinking about those securities is that they're the foundation or the pillars, if you will, that underpin our personal and our overall national security, in fact, international security. So keep that in mind as we would like to transition much more rapidly because of climate change. What is the effect going to be on energy security and economic security? We'd like to go to carbon-free energy tomorrow, but we can't do that with due consideration for the reliability of our ability to deliver energy in its various forms to end users for various purposes, military and civilian as well, domestically and internationally. So we really need to do this balancing act, if you will, to consider how fast can we accelerate the energy transition from fossil fuels to sustainable energy. And there are lots of metrics that have come into play. Back when I was working with Tom and for Secretary Mabus, we did a couple of things along the lines that Tom outlined. One, we wanted to build it and have them come in terms of biofuels. So we invested some money wisely in what we call farm to fleet. Can we use bio-based feedstocks to create what is effectively drop-in fuel for our ships and aircraft? And we were working with some very innovative companies on prototypes of actually doing that. And in fact, we actually had in let's see, it was been 2016, we had the Great Green Fleet exercise, part of RIMPAC in the Hawaii operating area. And we had allied ships, Korean ships, Japanese ships, Australian and Chilean, that were actually taking blended fuel. About 10% of it was actual biofuel that we had purchased. And it proved that you can, in fact, drop in various fuels to ships and everything's going to keep working. It doesn't just happen. You need to do a lot of research, and the Navy certainly did that and continues to do that. Along the same lines, we wanted to have drop-in fuel for aircraft. And one of the last and most fun things that Secretary Mabus did was to fly in the back seat of an EF-18 Growler airplane down at Patuxent River, Maryland. And it was fueled 100% by bio-based fuel. Very, very expensive. It was, shall we say, a prototype. We paid a lot of money for it, but we wanted to demonstrate that it wasn't just a percentage of fuel that you could put into an airplane, a fighter jet airplane, but you could run the whole thing flawlessly on 100% fuel, just to set that standard. That's what we are driving for. On our shore installations, Navy and Marine Corps bases, if you will, around the world, but especially in the United States, we wanted to try to move faster on getting off total reliance on carbon-based energy. And so in various locations, working with utilities and energy developers, we were able to deploy about 1.2 gigawatts of renewable energy, primarily solar, and much of that is continuing to produce great electrons these days. One in particular we are proud of, it's one of our first ones, was a 150 megawatt project, solar project based in just west of Phoenix, Arizona. And that supplies 1/3 of all the electrical power that is used by all of our Navy and Marine Corps bases in the state of California. Just every time the sun comes up, it's grabbing those photons and turning them into electrons, and it's displacing one heck of a lot of fossil fuel. I want to also talk about our role, if you will, in the military overall in terms of dealing with climate change. Climate change requires us to do two things. It requires us to mitigate where we can, that is, to try to avoid the worst effects of climate change and global warming by transitioning to using less fuel, i.e. fuel efficiency, and using less carbon-based fuel. So that the examples that I gave you of solar energy for shore installations and bio-based fuel are examples of that, early examples of that. The other thing we have to do is adapt. we're already in the grips of very, very severe weather. And I know that you folks in New Hampshire are really, really aware of this. Next door, what happened in Vermont in the summer with the deluges, we are going to be dealing with severe weather effects for a good long time. So go back a little bit in history. In 2007, the Center for Naval Analysis had a general counsel by the name of Sherry Goodman, who Tom just mentioned. Sherry put together what she called a military advisory board of about a dozen retired 3- and 4-star admirals and generals, all services represented and very, very senior, coming from combat backgrounds. And the purpose of this coming together, if you will, for the military advisory board was to take a look at climate change. In 2007, think about that, it seems like ancient history right now, but in 2007, the Military Advisory Board released a report called Climate Change and the Threat to National Security. People said, what? What are a bunch of retired admirals and generals with military backgrounds talking about climate change? Isn't that supposed to be the argument between big business and tree huggers? You know, tree huggers saying, you're ruining our world for us, our children, our grandchildren. Big business saying, you don't get help. With the military weighing in on climate change and the threat to national security, it helped to change the conversation. That this wasn't simply some warfare between people who like things just the way they were and people who really felt progress was the only way to go. And it really did change the conversation. In the Pentagon, every national security strategy document that has been produced since then has reflected the key part that climate change plays in military operations. In terms of, it is a mission creator. Tom mentioned humanitarian assistance, disaster relief. You can think about floods, typhoons, heat waves, sea level rise. But first there is the U.S. military with humanitarian assistance, disaster relief. But it can get very, very serious very, very quickly. Think about South Asia, 2 nuclear-armed countries, India and Pakistan, 4 rivers in that area with sacred meaning to many, many populations in there. Oh, by the way, food production, power production. And you think about what's happening with the Himalayan glaciers, and you can imagine a scenario in which the fights over water, whether it's too much because the ice pack isn't holding it as much water in the Himalayas as it once did, or not enough water because once that flood has happened, it slows to a trickle and people are really, really ready to go to war in many cases because they're literally, their personal lives and their national lives depend on it. So this is a very, very serious subject of climate change and what the military thinks about it, how the military thinks about it, and what they're doing about it. No one is happy with the pace of change, but there is change taking place. And wherever there can be technology advancements, changes in just how we use the existing technology by much more energy efficient routing of global C-17 flights going around the world supporting our military operations in support of the national security, or on bases, just in doing more and more renewable energy, deploying storage sites for renewable energy, doing better job with energy efficiency at the end use. So the list goes on. Let me just conclude my remarks by simply saying the military gets it. We deal with facts, not opinions. And those facts indicate that climate change is here. We need to accelerate the energy transition, not just in the military, but to serve as an example for everybody and what they can do, working with foreign militaries for both mitigation and adaptation measures and to move ahead. I think that great progress has been made, is being made. We just need to continue the dialogue. I'll end by one last point. you may be asking yourself, well, what can we do about it? Well, we need to change demand. It's easy for us to say, oh, it's the oil companies that are just, digging more wells and offshore and Alaska and everything like that. The oil companies are responding to demand. We need to change demand, our demand for fossil fuel. We've done a pretty good job so far on coal. We're starting to reduce the demand for oil, and natural gas is going to take a little bit longer, considered as it is a bridge fuel, to be able to get less carbon intense energy, but to do it in a way that doesn't impact adversely resiliency and energy security, and certainly doesn't impact affordability. So if you ask yourself, what can I do? Well, understand that we are all part of the problem, if you will, in creating that demand, but we're also part of the solution as we change that demand for ourselves, for our neighbors and colleagues. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
And I think Captain Smith is next up. Bam, bam,
Yeah.
you.
Yep. Thanks, Tom, and thanks, Admiral, for sharing that. Well, Tom and the Admiral take a look at this from a very macro strategic perspective. I'm going to give you a bit of a more of a operational and down to a tactical level perspective as a SEAL team commander. As introduced, my one of my previous commands was the Commodore of Naval Special Warfare Group 2, which had the East Coast SEAL teams deploying both to Iraq and Afghanistan. I had command in 2012 to 2014. Prior to that, I also had command of SEAL Team 2 in 2005 to 7. And, the early days of the Iraq and Afghanistan war, we were heavily reliant on the fossil fuels of the trucks, as Tom mentioned, the convoys of trucks taking bullets, food, water, batteries out to the troops in an expeditionary environment. And, to understand what I'm talking about in an expeditionary environment, I'll give you, to set the scene on this, is that in Afghanistan, you have the major forward operating bases. You got Kandahar, Bagram, Kabul. Those are the major bases that are heavily fortified. We fly in aircraft from the United States, and we have a full up. It's very similar to many of the U.S. bases. However, much of the operations is done expeditionary from those bases in a very austere forward. Even forward from that is another forward operating base. We called them village stability platforms, which were on the distances away from those major bases. And you would have anywhere from 12 to 20 troops at a time forward deployed from Bagram or from Kandahar or from Kabul out into the hinterlands of Afghanistan, working with the Afghanistan people. And this is where, when we talk about national security, we have to put those forces in a campaign strategy out there in order to conduct the campaign that we're exercising. And in order to supply and source them, it takes resources to get water, fuel, bullets, batteries for your radios out there, and generators. They're working off of generated power. They have generators that are working off of gasoline. You got to bring gasoline out to them. So as we were looking at this, and this is how we exercised the campaign in the early phase of the war. And then as I took command of the group, Secretary Mabus and Tom Mabus and Admiral McGinn, they were exploring with alternative energy sources for those forward deployed forces. What are the ways that we can source them without driving a fuel truck across a threatened environment in order to source them? So as I took command, SEAL Team 2 was forward deployed in Afghanistan at the time, and they were conducting experimentations forward on the battlefield with alternative ways to source it. And you can imagine, at an outpost in the hinterlands of Afghanistan, you have 12 guys working with the Afghan National Security Forces, and they're running a generator that is loud, and every enemy force can hear it and can locate exactly where that small outpost is. And so if we can come up with another, and they know that it's going to have to be refueled. So if we can come up with an alternative way to charge that generator through batteries, and two, if we don't even need to use a generator and we can recharge batteries to run reverse osmosis, water purification capabilities. Those are the things that these guys forward are worried about, is that where are we going to get our water from? Are we going to, ship in a truck that's going to have to drive 250 kilometers across bad guy land in order to deliver water to us? Or can we use some type of reverse osmosis water purification? And can we power that from a battery? And how do we recharge that battery? And so these were the experimentations that were going on at the time. This is at the tactical level. And as I went out to visit SEAL Team 2, they had actually panels that they would leave out in the sunlight. And from those panels, they could connect the leads to their batteries and recharge those batteries. There was another one where they actually spray painted a rock with a black spray paint fabric. And as they spray painted the rock, they had their leads that were connected to their batteries. And that rock was, with that spray paint, was actually recharging the battery. Now, in all honesty, these were the early stages and they were experimentation. But from this project in 2010 to 2012, they continued to experiment with this, and now that project is what we've phrased as a program of record in the military. And when you go from research, development, technology to program of record, that shows that the government and the Department of Defense has committed to sourcing that. So now we're looking at a program of record that is looking at all the different alternative energy sources that we can source the troops in the field. Now, one of the things that I also look at as a commander is I have to do this without loss of lethality. As a military commander, I have to maintain lethality throughout the whole battlefield process in order to exercise a campaign. And so as we were looking at this, it's not necessarily do we just stop delivering fuel to the outpost. It's how do we come up with an idea to phase off of the fuel? And that's really what we're looking at, and we continue to look at this as a campaign, is phasing off of the fuel rather than just disengaging from fuel. And as we phase off of it, and that's, as I, from 2012 to 2019, I saw this phasing come off. Now, in my current effort, I train the West Coast SEAL teams for their next deployment. And I have opportunity to watch the SEAL teams as they look at how are they going to source their next battle. And as Tom Oppel had mentioned it, the next battle where we fought the tyranny of distance, and it was from Kabul to the outpost in Afghanistan. Now it's the tyranny of distance across Africa, where you have forces operating in austere locations across the whole continent of Africa, and the tyranny distance of the Pacific Ocean. If you were, for example, the defense of Taiwan, we have to understand how are we going to resource or forward deploy troops in a defense of Taiwan strategy when you have operating through different island chains. And this is where we're looking at all the different alternatives to, rather than just resourcing the forces with a carbon footprint fuel, what are the alternatives? Some of the alternatives that we are actually seeing in use today is the solar powered battery operated devices. For example, many of our drones, we have now drones that drone warfare has been, as we saw it in Afghanistan, Iraq, and even in the counterterrorism, drones have become a significant portion of the military defense. Rather than operating them off of a fossil fuel, now we have drones that can fly around the world constantly with a solar powered battery. And in addition to that, on the ground forces, when we actually put our forces on the ground some of our tactical vehicles that we're looking at, battery operated, all of them. When I had command of SEAL Team 2 in 2007, every vehicle we had was a fuel vehicle. It was either diesel fuel or regular petrol fuel. Now, many of the vehicles that we have are battery operated, and we're actually looking at solar panel. And as we take a look even further and into the future, how are we going to operate this? And Lisa Marie will pick up from me after this, is that we're now exploring even beyond the battery operated. It's into, what can we do with a beaming energy being beamed, and also as well as small modular reactor type of energy that can source some of those austere locations. These are things that are being explored by the department, and not only by our own Department of Defense, but we can believe that these are being also explored by our allies and even some of our adversaries. So the importance for us to continue the innovation, and that's where back to both Admiral McGinn and Tom Oppel, is that the innovation being driven by the military. And so, I think Lisa Marie has some perspectives from, and bring this back up to a strategic level and geopolitical level. I'll turn it over to Lisa Marie to discuss some of the efforts and what her perspective is from a policy perspective.
Thanks, Bam Bam. Thanks. It's great to be participating with everyone on this call today. You've got some great insights from some very great minds who have actually kind of moved the ball over the course of our political past and now coming to our political future. So, I come at this a little bit differently than those you've heard from so far. I have not served in the military, but I am a Navy wife first and foremost. So, and now a Navy mother, because one of my children has just become an ensign this past July. So I have a great affinity for, the service and national security and what it means to our country and how energy is such a big part of that. I'll just take one quick step back and tell you a little bit about myself and how I come to the things that I'll talk about. I served early in my career as a Hill staffer, and what all of that means and everything. We all have some choice words, I think, to say about what's going on the Hill today. It certainly isn't what my naivete back in the day. I'm a true believer in policy and what the legislative process is to this. So it's really hard for me to watch where we are today, kind of mired in a bunch of kind of sound bites and partisan bickering. So it's taking that aside, it's very sad to see, because that's a branch of our government that is ceasing to function at the moment. Then from there, I went on as a business owner and spent most of my time helping businesses work around the government relations side, and most of it in national security, Air Force, a lot of it around nuclear power and nuclear energy. Then from there, congressional candidate myself. Then a senior leader in DOD when I was appointed to become the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for OSDLA, and basically had responsibility for the entirety of the DOD budget. So all the pockets, anything that would rise to the Secretary of Defense and the Deputy Secretary of Defense that they would go talk about, I would see it first, write it out for them. I'm sure you've all heard about Rumsfeld and his snowflakes and all that. I could tell you many good, fun stories about those times, but a really important time in our history of as where we were moving forward to, especially around energy. And then from there, I was the head of the National Security Council landing team for Trump, really building what the strategy would be for that administration as once they took office, where they were going to move and focus their time and attention, especially around DOD and then energy, because from there I took a position not on the National Security Council, but I had started a company already and needed to go back to what I was doing there. So I took an unpaid position to become the co-chair of the Nuclear Energy Advisory Committee, starting under Secretary Perry, and then moving for the entirety of the Trump administration in that role. And then back to a business owner, and now working in a partnership with Bob Smith, or Captain Smith. And we focus a lot on AI, ML, and national security and energy. And I give you that brief background to tell you what I kind of look at today. If you pair all of my history And I always say I'm a rarity in Washington. I always point to, the way you have success in this business and in this town is, I always call it the triangle. And you have to have all points of that triangle covered to be successful. One of those is the administration, one of them is the Congress, and the other is industry. And if you can't marry all of that together, one of those sides is going to get you every time. Because they all have parochial interests, they all have money, they all have aligned allegiances, and so you have to understand that whole picture in order to have success. So I asked the question, right now, where's the world headed? What will be the future contested environments? What's going to cause conflict in the future of our world? And I'd argue from my perspective, it's going to relate back, everything will relate back to energy. To me, energy is going to be the great equalizer of the future. We could say that IT and high tech and AI ML is what's driving what we talk about today. Before that, it was the early, when you have fossil fuels, and when we went into that changed. We have manufacturing. What's the next big thing coming? And it's going to be energy. And why is it energy? Because what are going to be the conflicts? We talked already, Tom mentioned food. How do you get food? How do you get clean water? How do you get resourcing? How do you get mobility? We've created this used to be a disconnected world. We, have the World Wide Web now, and everybody can talk. And so we've actually made the world a much smaller place. So how do we continue that? Energy is going to be the great equalizer, I would argue. And how do we then have a source of clean, renewable, and also sustaining energy sources for the world to all be able to partake from? Because if you don't have oil and, it's not a natural resource in your land, how can you still be a player and be a player of growth for not only but your people, but for your industry? So when I was at DOE, one of my big things was nuclear energy and SMR, small modular reactors. It's clean. If we get the NRC to kind of move and look at different ways, not big light water reactors, but smaller, where you're actually looking at hydrogen, or you're looking at pebble bed reactors, or you're looking at thermal reactors. I mean, there's a lot of bright people out there and a lot of bright companies that I had the ability to kind of look over what they were studying and what they were proposing. And some of them are quite far along. So I would argue that in the future, I'm sorry, I was just about to call him Bam Bam. So just let me take a big break here for a minute. Bob, as I know, it was my partner, he was a SEAL, as he told you, so military. And so he has a call sign. It's Bam Bam. I know him as Bam Bam. My husband's Chainsaw. So it's just kind of in that world, you kind of come out. So when I say Bam Bam, I'm referring to Captain Smith there. But anyway, how he talked about, the and so did Denny. The Navy has been at the forefront. And when we have nuclear aircraft carriers, we have nuclear submarines. They have taken a large capacity nuclear and made it small and made it mobile. And I'd say in the future, that's what we are going to need to do as a nation. And if we really want to address climate change, we as a nation have to be a leader in saying, how do we take things like SMRs and actually deploy them globally? And instead, after World War I and World War II, the United States came in and we brought in the money, we brought in the resources to help rebuilding. Well, we can do the same thing now around energy by bringing in these advanced technologies to help these nations, developing nations, actually be as competitive from a resourcing perspective for your basic needs, as well as for your manufacturing and future. And our biggest adversaries understand that. And China is, that's the big elephant in the room, but let's all call them out. They are actively, and in the times when I was at DOE, actively trying to buy the rights and the IP to the technologies our companies are developing today so that they can resource them in China. China will be one of the first nations to have a water problem. They already have, and it's becoming more and more dire, especially as their population grows. India will be another. So how do we be forward? How should we be forward thinking and looking? And Bam Bam mentioned a little bit about our Department of Defense and some of the things they're looking. There's an office in there called the Office of Operational Energy, OECIF. And you'd be surprised to know, some people think it was science fiction. We can talk about it now because it's all open source, but there's two programs that exist within there. One is called Pele and the other is called Spider. Pele actually looks at deploying satellites with solar arrays. And they have actually, we've tested it at the Naval Research Lab, being able to beam solar power by a laser to a almost like a cell solar receptor on the back of a vehicle, or on the back of a ship or an entity. Like Bam Bam said, if you were doing a resupply mission, instead of having to take the whole refueling truck with you, you could beam down power. So that's one. Two, the Spider is to actually do the same thing using RF, radio frequency. Now, those aren't deployable and ready to go yet, but it made me excited to know that we are thinking in those lanes, and we have moved thanks to efforts like Tom and crew and Mavis when they were there to actually say, let's set a standard that we need to try to meet. Theirs was, by 2020 and 2050. And now to carry through that, it forced a lot of great minds to actually rethink how we were doing things. And I followed in administration-wide after those guys, a little bit before with Bush and a little bit after, at DOE and the Trump administration. So, just to say that we didn't stop thinking and we didn't stop innovating. And now those are the things that we are carrying forward. And Bob and I are actually working a really interesting kind of technology now, is to say, how do we look at these energy sources in contested environments for our military? And that's how it'll start. Bob mentioned some of them when you talked about the paint and you talked about the batteries, but it's going to be more than that. I mean, that's the first step. And as we go for our next, and God forbid, let's hope it's outside of our lifetime, but if there is the next big war, if you will, it is going to be very different than the wars of the past. And I think that, part of what this call and what the efforts here are really focused on is, how do we look to that? How do we invest in those kind of things? And as we invest in them from a national security perspective, we're also investing them for our own homes here in the United States. You look with a small modular reactor with a footprint the size of a football field that can actually supply energy for a whole city. You put a couple of those together, that ring gets bigger and bigger. And so you can start actually supplying a whole entire state. So I know that this was a lot of, we wanted to get time for some questions, and I'm sure that there's a lot. So I'm going to be the shortest of the conversation here, so we can get to some of the questions and some of the thoughts that you all have. But it's kind of my approach. So thank you. Thanks for the time to be here today.
Thank you, Lisa Marie. Excellent. Very, very nice. So yes, we would like to turn to some questions. Audience folks still probably have time for more questions if you want to add them to the chat, and I'm sure people still have questions. I would like to start off by asking just a little bit about the SMRs, the small modular reactors, just because it did come up. I am a member of a listserv, which is international. It's got a lot of people attached to it. It's called Electric Brain Trust, and it's basically Amory Lovins and some other folks working on from utilities. A lot of professionals. Some of it goes way over my head, but there has been just recently an exchange about SMRs, and specifically about the NuScale, the Utah project, which was described as sort of a flagship project, the most promising SMR project, small modular reactor project, that just collapsed, and it didn't get enough subscriptions, and I guess the economics just didn't work out. And I'm wondering what's your perspective on that, and whether you are aware of what actually happened and how that kind of thing can be avoided. Is there a way to avoid the economic problems, which seem to be fairly chronic, at least recently, in that space?
Yeah. Well, as we said at the beginning of the call, before everyone else was on here, each of these energy sources have their own parochial interests around them, and they're all competing. And so there's a lot of things that fight against. Nuclear has never been, especially SMRs, something that the big fossil fuel providers would ever want to contend with. I mean, it's clean, it's easy. You know, we'd argue that the first thing out of the box when anybody mentions nuclear now is, oh my gosh, you got 5 Mile Island, you got Chernobyl, you've got Fukushima. You know, the sky is falling, and that's one of the things. So I think the first step is you know, an education campaign, and the Department of Energy started down that path, and they've continued that. You know, even it started before my time in there, but became really big while I was there, and it's continued since. First, you have to actually educate people that it's not. I mean, it's probably one of the safer. You have all kinds of accidents are related to fossil fuels, but people are just used to, oh my, you know, a car blew up, or you know, you can. I don't even have to say, but you know that it exists, but people don't seem to see that, so they think it's nuclear. With NuScale, I think one of the problems that they had, and it was one of the ones, and I knew that whole team, and it was a great team, and they were moving along very well. The problem is it was a smaller light water reactor. It's the same idea. So the same thing that people feared with large light water reactors, you're just making a smaller version of it. I think where you're really going to drive, and there's another company called X Energy that has a pebble bed reactor. And they're the ones that the NRC is actually looking right now. They're going and improving the actual Trisco ball pebbles, which has the uranium deep inside. And, you know, they've done a lot of the environmental impact studies on that, where if you, okay, let's just say you blew up the canister that had the pebbles in it, would they be, and everything you've tested so far, I actually can say my hand hasn't fallen off, but I've actually picked one up as well, you know, totally fine. So those are the things, and you have to, Bill Gates and his thermal reactor, he's got some interesting technologies. I can't speak outside the lines of some of the things folks are working on, but I can tell you that they are very innovative. And those, when we talk about SMRs, I think is the way that we're going to go. I think the NRC still looked and had some trouble with on the NuScale concept, which is that it's still a light water reactor, and you still have some of the problems and concerns that go along with, you know, light water reactors. You know, that would be the short answer. If I could tell you, there's a lot more that went into it, but that's the easy answer, just to answer your question.
Yeah. Well,
Let me just add
that
one of the things that, and this is a unfortunate side effect, but it's reality. And there are some people inside the Navy, particularly in the nuclear program, who are a little reluctant to deal with a bigger commercialization of SMRs, or, you know, nuclear power generally in the civilian world, out of fear that, you know, that they'll have to compete in terms of pay for nuclear officers who leave the military and go to work in the commercial side, the civilian side, much like the Navy and the Air Force have to compete with the airlines and FedEx and for pilots. There's obviously a tremendous amount of money that is devoted to training pilots, to training nuclear officers, and the Navy's, you know, there are many people inside that are a little reluctant to have to deal with that competition on the nuke side that they have to deal with on a regular basis on the aviation side. So that's just one little factor that's having.
Reinmar, Denny here. I would add none other than James Hansen, if you will, from NASA fame, and basically the guy that laid out the challenge of global warming, is very much in favor of the development and deployment of nuclear power. Small modular reactors offer some advantages over the large scale ones that we've grown up with, if you will. My own personal view is that it has to be a part of our future energy mix, but it has to be done very, very carefully. NuScale's problems are just an indicator of a technology that is being developed. And it needs to be matured. And it's good that there are other competing technologies besides NuScale's approach, and that NuScale is not going out of business. They have that project that is on the back burner, shall we say, but they have other projects globally that they're working as well.
Yeah.
You know, I'd also add that as you take a look at the SMRs, a lot of it, you know, I would say that we United States are actually behind some of the other countries, France, Canada, UK, and Russia, and particularly China. And so I think that, we should be, cognizant of where other efforts in the SMR technology development is going. So we need to be cognizant of both of our allies and our adversaries with SMRs.
Yeah, I guess just as a follow-up, I guess my impression has been that the problems are not so much technological, although obviously some of the technology is in development still, but actually economic. That the problem that it doesn't add up. The numbers don't add up. And connected with that, there's a question from an audience member in the chat. Is there funding in the IRA for SMRs? Is there actual set-asides within the IRA funds for this research?
Yes, there is.
Oh, go ahead, Denny.
No, go ahead, Tom. There is money in the IRA for SMRs.
No, all I was going to do is, and I'm not as cognizant of what's happening with SMRs, although I do agree that we've got to take some dramatic steps to deal with climate change. Obviously, we are seeing more and more impacts, and we can't just flip the switch and turn off the energy flow. Nuclear power offers an opportunity to reduce our carbon footprint fairly quickly. But I will say that we saw this, in terms of biofuels. Denny mentioned this a little bit. When we did the demonstration of the Great Green Fleet in the Pacific, we, as Denny mentioned, we bought a small amount of biofuels for the demonstration project. And it cost something like $26 a gallon. But, that's what happens when you're doing, when you're testing, when you're doing demonstration projects, and you buy a small amount because you're testing it, you're seeing if it works. And the focus for the media, they couldn't get over that $26 a gallon figure, even though within a couple of years, the Defense Department, which buys all the fuel for all of the services, the Defense Department had put out procurement looking for biofuels, and the cost had dropped down to within a few pennies of conventional diesel in just a few years. So, I think again, my guess is the economics of nuclear reactors, particularly SMRs, right now we're dealing with a limited deployment. As you start to expand, the deployment of it, the cost per unit is gonna significantly come down, just as it did for biofuels.
Yeah, it's like anything in scale in business. Once you can, market at scale, sell at scale, and deploy at scale, prices will come down. You also, and look at any platform in the Department of Defense that we build and start up. When it starts off, the initial platform and the R&D and all that goes behind is very expensive. Think of missile defense, think of our aircraft carriers, think of anything. Think of when we went from, non-nuclear powered aircraft carrier to the nuclear powered aircraft carrier. The price tag between the two was huge, and this is going to be anything in time. It's a mission of scale and time. Once the investment starts, once you prove that it works, and then you start deploying, those prices will come down, and they'll come down from a global perspective, because it won't just be the United States using them. It will be everyone in the world using them, and for obvious different reasons. I mean, just think the byproducts of an SMR are water, and think about the water problems that we have in the world. The steam that comes off of that. It's I always operate. Bob will tell you, I'll call you Bam Bam again, in a win-win scenario. And anything that you do and you undertake, it has to be a win for all sides concerned. And so I think once you really get the mindset of those procuring and buying to understand upfront costs with anything, because it's new, is high, but long-term scaled cost becomes much lower. And when you go long-term, when it's deployed, I mean, nuclear energy is on pennies compared to any fossil fuel or anything else that we have out there.
Can I just say, we've been talking about this, and I'm going to embarrass Bam Bam and tell the story. Nicknames and call signs for aviators and others in the military always tend to be the most embarrassing thing that they can find. It's never, the nicknames or the call signs are never quite what you see in Top Gun, for example. It's always to try and poke fun and humiliate in some way possible. And as I understand the story, and Bam Bam, correct me if I'm wrong, as a young junior officer, Bam Bam showed up at his first SEAL team command, as you are required to do in the military in your dress uniform. In his case, it was dress whites. Shows up at the command, and the SEAL teams tend to be, because of who they are and how they operate, they're not quite always within naval regulations in terms of hair length or dress, and so he shows up, and one of the leaders of the SEAL team, as then I guess Ensign Smith shows up knocking on the door, and Ensign Smith reporting for duty, sir. And one of the folks in the SEAL team looked at him and said, "Well, look, it's Bam Bam all grown up," and it stuck. Did I get it close, Bam Bam?
Yeah, you got it exactly right. And and getting back to, I'm reading a lot of the questions on the comment board, and I think there's a trend in there. There's one of the questions, one of the people was asking about, hey, should we be, the military, focused on winning wars and instead of climate change? Absolutely. That's 100% correct. The Department of Defense should, their primary focus is winning the conflicts that we're involved in. Climate change is a piece of that. It is not the end state, but it is, something, a contributing factor to us winning wars. And yes, we're not at the point now where we can actually, battery operated, F-35 in order to provide air support for a MEF. And yes, the MEF has a different energy requirement than a 12-man SEAL platoon, out. But all of this is this is what we're talking about, is that we can't do business the way that we have always done business in tomorrow's operating environment. It just can't be done. The tyranny of distance, the defense systems in the Pacific that we are going to be up against, you're not going to be able to drive a fuel ship to support the MEF going ashore in the Pacific in a protracted campaign with a near peer adversary in the Pacific. It just can't be done. We're going to need to come up with alternative ways to fight wars and to win wars in order to support troops ashore, troops from the air, and troops from the sea. And so that's, are we there yet? No, we're not there. Are we going to have to, rely on some fossil fuels in the near term? Yes, we're going to rely on some fossil fuels. Are we transitioning off of them because we might not be able to get those fossil fuels all the way from Hawaii to the first island chains? Yeah, I think we are going to take a look at other ways to do it, rather than having a oil tanker sail across that and putting that oil tanker and all the troops in danger. So, I just wanted to, I'm reading the comments, and I think your comments are absolutely right. And from my perspective, we haven't taken our eye, and I do train the SEAL teams, and we train with the MEF, and we train with the Naval Expeditionary Forces. And I can tell you that we have not taken our eye off the ball of winning wars. But what we have added to our calculus of winning wars is, how are we going to win them leveraging all the energy sources available to us?
I want to endorse what Bam Bam just said entirely. And it's really important not to have a zero-sum mentality. It isn't a question of, well, we can either win wars or we can address climate change. We can do both. We have to do both. It's absolutely necessary. business as usual isn't an option. And the environment is changing, literally and figuratively. The geopolitical environment is changing. And like it or not, global warming, climate change are here. It's a new challenge. It's one that has to be faced by all of us, but especially by our great men and women in uniform. And they are going to both win wars and address climate change, and win wars by addressing climate change in many cases.
If I could just add one thing, in the time that I had the honor of serving at the Navy, one of the things that we talked about was the importance of naval presence around the globe, U.S. naval presence around the globe. And the importance is that, as Sun Tzu said, the first objective of a military is not to have to fight, is to deter conflict. And that's why we have a naval presence around the globe. Seeing an aircraft carrier pull into your bay or pull up close to your shore is a pretty damned impressive sight, and has an impact on the psychology. So it's the reason we do the freedom of navigation through the Straits of Taiwan. It's the reason we do these. We have 2 carriers now in the Mediterranean to try and defer a fight, not to provoke one. That's not what the United States has done in its past or will do in its future. We don't start fights. We try to deter that conflict, and then obviously, as both Bam Bam and Denny have said, we're prepared to win the fight if we have to fight.
Yeah, and I'm just going to jump on with one thing. We're all talking, at least the 4 of us are a little older generationally, but the generations behind us, our children, they are already more climate change and environmentally focused. If you look at all the universities now that have environmental science programs, several of my nieces and nephews are pursuing those kind of degrees. They think a lot different. So, they're tomorrow's leaders. And they're already building. Someone asked, how do we change that argument? Well, that argument's already built into their vocabulary. They already talk about it and address it in a much different way than we do. So I think that's a helpful future sign. Those are our future men and women in uniform. They're our future leaders. And protecting the environment is key. I mean, they started learning about it when they were in kindergarten and 1st grade. So I think that's also a plus as we move forward, because generationally, that's going to be built into their planning and their processing and what they deploy.
One of the things that when I first got to the Secretary of the Navy's office, working for Secretary Mavis, and it's a mindset that we always looked at, but I never heard it couched in terms the way Secretary Mavis said. He said he sees energy as a weapon, energy as a weapon, not used just by us, but energy as a weapon used by our adversaries against us. And when we talk, that's on energy. But when we talk, climate change, the other thing that I saw working for Secretary Mavis is, yes, we are addressing winning wars, and it is not a priority of climate change, but climate change and winning wars, you have to take into account, for example, the polar ice cap. The polar ice cap, we are doing, the Department of Defense has experiments and studies. We call it ICEX, but we look at the polar ice cap. And, there's scientific proof that there is, some receding of the polar ice cap, which, at some point, the receding can and will cause additional waterways for our adversaries, the Russian fleet, as another alternative waterway, and we have the responsibility of freedom of navigation in those waterways. And it's not just the freedom of navigation and securing those waterways that may become available to our adversaries, but also the resources underneath on the ocean floor of those waterways, which is potential energy sources for our adversaries. So when we look at, we say, it's not. We're not looking at climate change to win wars. We're looking at climate change to, as a impact on us and the ability to win a war.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much, everybody. I think we've got to pretty much close, and I do want to, as a sort of a last a little detail, bring it back to something that Tom said right at the beginning. Actually, it's on his website that back in 2017, the Navy had actually reduced its energy consumption by vast amounts, 60% renewables on land and 40% at sea. And Tom, I just wanted, as a last little thing, if you have any, uh, if you can share with us, what's happened since then, because that's actually a while back now, 2017, when you guys left. But what's happened since then in the Navy? Has that trend and that trajectory continued? And for that matter, in the other services as well?
Well, look, I always root for Navy. And so, I love talking about what Navy's done. I have to admit that the Air Force and the Army, we're making steps. There was a little bit of a competition going on while we were there, and I think that's continued. I mean, I think everybody sees that climate change is going to be is something that's happening, and you're going to have to deal with it, and it's going to impact deterring war. It's going to impact how you fight a war. It's going to impact every aspect of the military mission. So yes, progress has continued. A lot of the work that Denny did as the Assistant Secretary for Energy, Installations, and Environment. I used to tell Secretary Mavis we needed one more I and O just to get to the old McDonald agency. But a lot of the work that Denny and his folks did, at Secretary Mavis's direction, he was insistent that what we try to do was achieve it in such a way that the progress would continue no matter what. And I think Lisa Marie can confirm that work has continued. People understand, and as I said, every single service chief ever since, every SecDef, every single service chief, all of the Joint Chiefs have continued to acknowledge the role that climate change impacts global security. And so all of that progress has continued. And frankly, the research done by ONR, the Office of Naval Research, and the other services is critically important, not just to making sure that we always have, as Secretary Mavis always liked to say, we never want to be in a fair fight. We want to be in a fight we know we're going to win from the beginning. We don't believe in fair fights. So all of that research is going into making sure that we have the most lethal force, that we have a force that we can bring to any fight and win it. But we also, again, I think, there's nobody that I've ever met in the military who wants to go fight. The idea is, again, look at Sun Tzu. The idea is the best fight is the one you don't have to fight, is the one you win simply by being prepared. So yes, the work is going on.
Great. Well, I just want to thank all four of you so much for your generous spending your time with us and your insights. I think it's been extremely valuable. I always feel bad because we never get to all of the questions, and there's always good questions that people have, but we just always have limited time, and I don't like to go over. So I think with that, we'll call it an evening, and maybe we'll have you all back sometime. We can continue this conversation.
Sure.
So thanks very much again, everybody, and thanks to the
Thank
audience
you.
as well for being here.
Thank you all for doing this.
Everyone
Yeah.
have a lovely evening. Thank you.
Thank you.